We have started talking about Herod, and this is the same Herod who is ruling in Israel when Christ is born. It's not the same Herod, of course, that was involved in his trial much later, and the beheading of John the Baptist. That was this guy's son, one of his sons. But yeah, studying the life of Herod is going to bring us right up to New Testament times. This morning I was talking with Josie, and we had a conversation instead of getting ready for church on time like we should have. But it was a good one, just about fathers and parents in general, the legacy that we pass on to our kids, the fact that if we struggle with something, if something's a part of our life, that it's just because of the way that God has designed families and designed parents and children. They imitate us. That's going to be something that if we don't resolve, if we don't fight and overcome, they're going to have to fight it and overcome it themselves without help, without guidance that they naturally receive by watching us, and the way that sins get passed on from generation to generation in that way. The responsibility we have and the way that we can understand ourselves and the struggles we have by looking back. And that's kind of the whole idea of history. When we get into church history especially, it's going to become exciting in a whole new way, because we're going to be seeing things that explain where we are today, that help us understand why our doctrinal statements say the things they do, the way they say them, and the values that we have, some that we have drifted away from, some that we've clung to very tightly as part of our identity. Who we are, sometimes we can be very ignorant of if we're not aware of where we came from and just take for granted certain things. Herod, his life is just a great example of the concept that we can understand where we are by understanding our past. What we're going to learn today is going to explain what we see of Herod in Matthew so much. And Herod, near the end of his life, he was paranoid. He was terrifying in a lot of ways. He was not popular. He had some real problems. But who he was not a madman. He was not irrational in what he did. Yes. Irrational means what you do makes no sense. What Herod did was wrong, but from his perspective, he was doing the right thing. And yeah, so this today is going to give us the background for that incident in his life, the incident we're most familiar with. But going back and reviewing a little bit, Herod and his brother Phaziel, and they had other brothers, younger brothers as well, but they were the two important ones. They were the ones that their father put in charge when he became in charge of governing, of ordering life in Israel. He made his son Herod the governor of Galilee, Phaziel the governor of Jerusalem, which means Judea, the southern part of Israel. And later, after the death of Caesar, after that whole civil war, the second civil war that was fought by the Romans between those who had loved Caesar and those who had hated him, and the rebels, the assassins, the people who had killed Caesar, were defeated by Mark Antony and Octavian. And Mark Antony declared Herod and Phaziel tetrarchs over the Jewish people. So basically kings. They have the power of kings in their nation. Nobody could tell them no, except somebody higher up above them, except the Roman government itself. The Senate had the real power. If they wanted to, they could take away the rights that they had given. But essentially, Herod and Phaziel had perfect freedom in Israel to rule. Yeah.
Why would somebody want to rule a country when they just die easily?
Why would someone want to rule if what?
If they would just die easily.
Easily. Yeah, it's dangerous to rule. People who are in charge are often targets for other people who want power. So, yeah, if somebody is in charge, if somebody is ruling, it can be fun because you can do what you want, but it can also be very, very dangerous. And you always have to be wondering, do these people want to be my friends because they like me, or do these people want to be my friends so that they can get close to me and become powerful themselves and then maybe kill me so they can be in charge? Okay, so yep, it's a good thing, but it's not a good thing at the same time to be in charge.
It's
Yeah.
you're a target.
Yep, it makes you a target. Yeah, and when Herod and Phaziel became in charge, they got the authority that used to belong to the high priest, Hyrcanus II. The high priest used to have that authority, at least technically. He had no political authority anymore after this point. He was only the spiritual authority from this point on. And Herod had already had some run-ins with Hyrcanus, if you recall, killing those bandits up in Galilee. Had gotten him in trouble with the Sanhedrin. There was a big debate over whether he had the right to do that. And so there was a bit of a rift there. And many Jews still saw Hyrcanus as the rightful ruler and longed for Israel to regain its independence from Rome, to go back to the days when the high priest was their king and they didn't have any higher king to be accountable to. So that was an obstacle that Herod had to face. But Herod and Hyrcanus did come together, actually. They made up pretty well, and what brought them together was a common enemy. This guy is Antigonus II. He is Hyrcanus's nephew. Remember the whole getting under the power of Rome in the first place happened because of a civil war between Hyrcanus and his brother, Aristobulus. This is Aristobulus's son. That side of the family never gave up on the dream of ruling the country. They never gave up the idea that they deserved to rule. And Antigonus is now the only one left, and he is going to continue on that fight. He invaded Galilee, conquered a lot of it. Herod retaliated and got a lot of it back. Antigonus got 3 fortresses that he still kind of maintained strength in, but Herod defeated him pretty soundly, and Herod and Hyrcanus became close allies because of this. Antigonus was the enemy of them both, and their relationship was healed. They actually got pretty tight, which Herod needed. Herod needed, if he wanted to be seen as legitimate, a good relationship with the Hasmonean family, the ruling family of Israel. And so in order to strengthen his relationship with Hyrcanus and legitimize his authority, Herod, he was married already, but he divorced his first wife and betrothed Mariamne, Hyrcanus's granddaughter. And we don't know what she looks like. Obviously, they didn't paint paintings. But yeah, Mariamne was a Hasmonean princess. She was granddaughter to Hyrcanus and notoriously beautiful as well. And this wasn't just a good political match. This was a person that Herod fell in love with, legitimately, fiercely in love with. His previous marriage was to a woman named Doris, and they had a son, and Herod named him after his father, so Herod's first son was Antipater II. But his marriage to Doris most likely was arranged by his father. And this marriage, his marriage to Mariamne, was one that he arranged for himself. It was a good political match, and it was a love match as well, at least on Herod's side. Not necessarily on hers, and it wasn't a happy marriage. We're going to get to that next time. But Herod was constantly aware that the Jews saw him as an outsider, as the son of an Idumean man and an Arab woman. Yeah, Herod wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a real Israelite. He followed the Israelite laws, and he believed in God. He didn't follow God very well all the time, but he believed that God was real, just like an Israelite, but he wasn't related closely to the Israelites. He was a descendant of Esau. Remember Jacob and Esau? The Israelites were descended from Jacob, and Herod was descended from Esau. So not all of the Israelites liked him. But by marrying Mariamne, Herod could have heirs. Herod could have sons to take over for him that were part of the Hasmonean family by blood, that had not only Jewish blood, but royal Jewish blood. By doing this, not him himself maybe, but his successors could be seen as legitimate Jewish rulers. This is what he wanted. Okay, so in 40 BC, the year after Herod and Phaziel became tetrarchs, not long afterwards at all, and the same year that Herod and Mariamne were betrothed, they weren't married yet, but they were betrothed, the Parthians invaded Syria. You remember who the Parthians were? They were the big empire to the east of the Roman Republic, and they were fighting with Rome over control of Syria and Israel. That area right there was important to them. Yeah. Some of them did ride camels, yes. Just like you see in the picture. Yep, those are Parthian warriors. And yeah, they were Rome's greatest rival, the greatest threat to Roman power. Remember, Crassus had tried unsuccessfully to conquer them 13 years before this, and he's the one who got melted gold poured into his mouth, according to the story, because of his greed. But more recently, the Parthians had been involved in Roman conflicts. They had fought alongside the rebels, alongside Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi, where they were defeated. So the Parthians have just suffered this defeat, and they're a little sore about it. They decide they're going to take over Syria, carve off this side of the Roman domain, and make it theirs. So Antigonus in desperation, he used this as an opportunity to try to gain power for himself. Antigonus met with the Parthians in Syria after they had taken over and promised them 1,000 talents and 500 noble Jewish women if they agreed to install him as their client king in Judea. If they would make him king, take over his country, basically Israel would become a client kingdom to the Parthians instead of a client kingdom to Rome. He was willing to make that deal. because he desired power for himself so much. It wasn't what was best for the country, clearly. But after they had seized control of Syria, the Parthians sent Antigonus with an army into Judea. And Hyrcanus, Herod, and Phasael were besieged in the palace at Jerusalem with very little hope of escape. The war was not going their way at all. The Parthian Empire was very near, their army was very near, and the Roman army was far away. So the Parthians invited Phasael and Hyrcanus to Galilee for peaceful negotiations. So the high priest, Hyrcanus, and Herod's brother, Phasael, they were invited to Galilee to talk this out, to see what kind of settlement they could come to. Herod did not trust the Parthians or Antigonus, and he begged his brother and his father-in-law-to-be not to go. And unfortunately, Herod turned out to be right. Phasael and Hyrcanus did end up going, accepting the invitation. But while they were with the Parthians, Phasael discovered a plot to kill both him and Hyrcanus, but not before Herod was captured. The Parthians wanted all of the leadership to be captured and killed at the same time. But Phasael was able to send an urgent message to Herod, alerting him to the Parthians' plans. And actually, Phasael had an opportunity to escape. He could have gotten away. At this same time, he chose to stay with Hyrcanus, to not abandon him. Remember, there's a noble streak in this family alongside the ruthless streak that we so often think of. But Herod received this message from his brother, and as soon as he fled with his family, and by the way, all the noble women in Jerusalem, the people that Antigonus had promised to the Parthians, he took them too, away from the city. And some of them he just scattered, he sent into the rest of the country down in the southern part. But some of them so Idumea, he hid them in Idumea. But his family and many of those who were the most important, he put in the desert stronghold of Masada. And if the name Masada sounds familiar, that's the name of the fortress where the Jews made their final stand in their rebellion in 70 AD, and where many of them committed suicide, according to the story. But that's where Herod hid them. It was the strongest place in Israel, the most defensible of all its fortresses. Yeah. Suicide means killing yourself. Yep. Some people, and even, back in the days of the Maccabean revolt, there were some people, some Jews, who got it into their head that it was more noble to kill themselves than to be captured by the enemy soldiers. But, that's for another week. Right now, the Parthians, when they realized Herod had fled, and by the way, when Herod fled to Masada, along the way, it wasn't the Parthians who really gave him trouble, it was Jews who were on Antigonus's side. They harassed him, they attacked him as he went, and he defeated them on his way to Masada. He fought his way out with these refugees. But as soon as Herod had made that escape, the Parthians dropped all pretext of friendliness. They arrested Phasael and Hyrcanus, took them captive, and then they marched south to Jerusalem. They sacked Jerusalem, they plundered it, along with the surrounding countryside. And this is from the Jewish Antiquities by Josephus. And so Antigonus was brought back into Judea by the king of the Parthians, and he received Hyrcanus and Phaziel for his prisoners. So the Parthians handed Hyrcanus and Phaziel over to Antigonus to do what he wanted with them. Antigonus was greatly disappointed that the women he had promised to the Parthians had escaped. And he also feared that the people might rebel against him and restore the kingdom to Hyrcanus. So, what he did was there's some difference here between the accounts, how exactly he did this. We know what he did. This says with his own teeth he did it. He bit off Hyrcanus's ears, which might seem like a weird and random thing to do. But he did this in order that he might never be able to take the high priesthood again. Would someone like to look up Leviticus 21, 16 through 21? Actually, this is a longer section. I can just read it myself. I have it here. But in Leviticus 21, it has these regulations for someone who wants to be a priest. And God says, "For no one who has a defect shall come near." A defect means something wrong with them physically, something wrong with their body. A blind man or a lame man, or someone who has a disfigured face or any deformed limb, or a man who has a broken foot or a broken hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or one who has a defect in his eye or eczema or scabs or crushed testicles. No man among the seed of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall approach and bring near the offerings to Yahweh by fire. Since he has a defect, he shall not approach to bring near the food of his God. So, disfigured face, that would involve this kind of mangling to the ears that Antigonus did. And in the mind of the people, Hyrcanus deserved to be king because he was high priest. If he was no longer the high priest, if he was no longer qualified for that office, then he could no longer claim any right to authority in Israel. So, and it shows you a little bit what kind of a person Antigonus was. He was a bit of a brute. He was a man warped by holding on to anger for a very long time. But Josephus goes on to say, Phaziel, so Herod's brother, realizing that he would soon be put to death, could not bear the thought of dying dishonorably at the hand of his enemy. And again, there's some disagreement between accounts on this too, so it might have happened in a slightly different way. But this one says, therefore, since his hands were bound behind him, he couldn't use them, he fell forward and dashed his head against a great stone, thereby taking away his own life. However, before he died, Phaziel heard from a certain woman that his brother Herod had escaped the enemy. To which he replied that he could face death cheerfully, since he left behind one who would avenge him. So Hyrcanus is disqualified from the priesthood, and Phaziel is dead, most likely by his own hand. Some accounts say other things. And by the way, this is Masada right here. This is a picture of it. The place where Herod brought those most important refugees after they had fled from Jerusalem. It's a fortress on the coast of the Dead Sea. And most of what you see in that picture, a lot of the buildings, especially the ones on the side of the mountain, those were built later by Herod. He made this place even greater after he became king. The ramp that you see over on that side going up, the absolutely humongous thing, that was built by the Romans even later, during the Jewish war. But that's the place they went to. Virtually impossible to get up and attack. Herod himself, though, did not stay at Masada. He didn't hole himself up and wait for Antigonus to take over the country. And Antigonus did start calling himself king from that point on. For about 3 years, he called himself king and high priest, and even started making coins with those titles on them. But Herod didn't stay at Masada. He continued first to Nabatea. Remember, that's where his mother was from, that Arab country where Edom used to be. He went to Nabatea, but he was refused help there. So instead, he traveled to Egypt and booked the first ship that he could find sailing to Rome. Cleopatra the seventh, who's the queen of Egypt at this point, she's the one in charge, she urged him to wait for a better time of year before setting sail. It was winter, and we remember the Mediterranean in winter. You don't sail it. There are storms. However, Herod knew the political situation in Rome wasn't very stable. There was already some tension growing between Octavian and Mark Antony. And he didn't know how long Mark Antony was going to be in charge or have real power there. And Mark Antony is the one he was relying on. Mark Antony is the one who gave Herod and Phasael their tetrarchships in the first place. So Herod left at once, in spite of the danger. Yeah.
Picture for quite a long time.
Oh, that picture is just of a ship in a storm on the way to Rome. Herod's ship was caught in a storm, and they had to jettison its the cargo to keep it afloat. But he did make it safely to Rome eventually. And as soon as he was in Rome, Herod went to Antony, presented him with some gifts, and gave him an account of everything that had happened in Judea. And he asked Antony, and this was his plan, to have the Senate declare Hyrcanus's grandson, Aristobulus III, king of Judea. Now, Aristobulus III was Mariamne's brother, so Herod's future brother-in-law. He was still young at this point. He was only 13 years old right now. But if they would declare him king, that's a king that the Jews would accept more than they would accept Antigonus, someone with a more legitimate claim. And it would make Herod still a very powerful man, since he would be the king's brother-in-law. That's his idea. That's what he pitched. However, Mark Antony and the Senate rejected that idea. They didn't like it. Aristobulus III, because he was so young and untested and also extremely Jewish and popular with his fellow Jews, he could turn into the same kind of problem as Antigonus. He could revolt against Rome. The Romans didn't trust him. Herod, they trusted. Herod was a man who had proven himself to be on the Romans' side. And so, on Mark Antony's recommendation, the Senate bestowed on Herod the official title, King of the Jews. That was his title, King of the Jews. And Antony and Octavian left the Senate house with Herod between them. They honored him that night with a great feast. And only a week after he had arrived in Rome, Herod departed again for Israel. And he traveled he went on land this time, and traveled south through Syria and then Galilee, putting down resistance and raising an army as he went. And a lot of the Jews who weren't on Antigonus's side joined him. They saw his splendor, they saw his courage, and he was an inspiring leader, and a lot of people wanted to follow him. A lot of people really hated Antigonus for everything the Parthians had done. Okay, but that was just the beginning of a war. We won't look at all of the details, but it was a war that lasted 2 years. And you can kind of see the lines. That red line is where Herod went and what he did during that time. His younger brothers did some stuff during this war. His younger brother Joseph was captured and beheaded, after which Herod captured and beheaded the commander who had done it. He also returned to Masada, was reunited with his family down there at the Dead Sea, right there. And he also married Mariamne during this time, gave himself that extra little boost of legitimacy that would get even more of the Jews on his side. And finally, in 37 BC, Herod and Sausius, the Roman governor of Syria, besieged Jerusalem together, using the same strategy that Pompey had used before. They built a ramp up on the north side of the temple to get in. And so Herod really cared about the country. Sausius and his men, not as much. But the siege lasted 5 months. And it happened to be a Sabbath year, so the city ran out of food more quickly than it would have normally. Remember, every 7th year, they were supposed to not plant crops. It was one of those years this year. But it still lasted for 5 months in spite of that fact. And both the Jews in Jerusalem and those outside fighting both firmly believed that God was on their side. It was a religious war for both of them, both armies. The Romans just became more and more agitated as the siege dragged on. But this is from Josephus, from the Jewish Antiquities again. When the outer court of the temple and the lower city were taken, the Jews fled into the inner court of the temple and into the upper city. Then, fearing that the Romans would hinder them from offering their daily sacrifices to God, they sent ambassadors requesting permission to bring in beasts for sacrifices. I remember just a little bit ago when, during the civil war between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, the priests had asked for sacrifices during Passover as they were holed up in the temple, and the people refused to give it to them. Herod gave them the beasts that they needed. He granted their request, hoping that they would finally yield. But when he saw that they still bitterly opposed him and fought to preserve Antigonus as their king, he made an assault upon the city and took it by storm. Then every part of the city was filled with those who were slain, both by the rage of the Romans at the long duration of the siege. They were fed up, happy to finally get some fighting in, or killing in at least, and also the zeal of the Jews that were on Herod's side, who were not willing to leave even one of their enemies alive. So for both of these reasons, the slaughter was absolutely terrible. And crowds of people were murdered in the narrow streets, in the houses, and as they were flying to the temple for shelter. And the people attacking took no pity on women, infants, or the aged. Though Antigonus sent word beseeching them to spare the people, no one restrained their hand from slaughter. Then Antigonus, without regard to his past or present circumstances, finally shows some humility, some care for other people. came down from the citadel and fell humbly at the feet of Sosius, the governor of Syria. However, Sosius took no pity on him, but mocked him ruthlessly, calling him Antigona, a woman, basically, because of his cowardly behavior, and put him in custody. Then Herod, feeling that the victory was turning out to be worse than a defeat, began asking Sosius many times, begging him to stop the killing, asking him whether the Romans planned to empty the city of both money and men, leaving him king of a desert. Sosius told him that his soldiers had the right to seize plunder as compensation for the siege they had endured. Herod replied that he would give every soldier a reward out of his own money, and by this means redeem what remained of the city from destruction. So this is what he did. Herod performed what he had promised, for he gave a noble present to every soldier, and even greater presents to their commanders, and a most royal present to Sosius himself, till they all went away full of money. Herod had to pay them to stop sacking the city. Sosius, meanwhile, brought Antigonus up to Mark Antony in Antioch. And Mark Antony planned to bring Antigonus back as a captive to Rome, as they had done with his father. And Herod didn't like this idea. Remember, the whole family at one time or another had escaped from the Romans and come back and made trouble before. He doesn't want that happening again. Herod sent Antony a large sum of money with a message requesting Antigonus's death. Antigonus is the one kneeling there who's about to get his head cut off. Because this is what Mark Antony did in order to, and as long as he was alive, even if he didn't escape, his supporters in Israel would hope for his return, and they would hold back allegiance from Herod himself. Herod's authority would be weakened just by his survival. So, on Mark Antony's orders, Antigonus was beheaded at Antioch. And so the rebellious branch of the Hasmonean line was finally eliminated. This family that caused nothing but trouble for the nation, and Herod's heirs would have a real claim to the Judean throne in both the eyes of the Jews and the Romans. Like, things are set up perfectly now for a stable, long Jewish kingdom under the authority of Rome, but with a good relationship with Rome moving forward. This didn't quite happen, and we're going to find out why as we go on. But I want to think, before we leave, about the incident near the end of Herod's life that we're most familiar with. A long time after this, wise men came to Jerusalem from the east, the Bible says, asking who has been born King of the Jews. Now, where is the east? The east from Judea. What was east? It was the Parthian Empire. And who is most likely, who has wise men, who is most likely to be familiar with Jewish prophecy? From here? Well, from Judea, it was the Parthian Empire. And Babylon, specifically, is the most likely place for these people to come from. Babylon was in the Parthian Empire at this time. So most likely, almost certainly actually, there was a delegation of high-ranking people from Parthia, coming to Jerusalem, asking who is born, who has a rightful blood right, just because of the family they come from, to rule the nation of Israel. And Of course, that's Herod's title itself, King of the Jews. It's a direct threat to his reign. And how is Herod going to interpret this? As a Parthian plot to take over the country, to use a kid as an excuse to overthrow him and get the common people of Israel, with whom Herod was not popular at that time, on their side. And so even if Herod didn't believe the prophecy about the Messiah, he had a reason to be worried. He was always on the lookout for threats, and he would have interpreted that as a genuine threat to his rule. So as I said, he was ruthless, and he was paranoid, and we're going to find out some of the reason for that and how that happened next time. But he wasn't irrational, even at the end of his life. We all become who we're becoming. And who Herod was becoming at this time was a very different person than who he started out as. Any thoughts, questions about all of that? Yeah.
Oh, as Herod been building the mountains, well, I was listening to what was the Jewish army like? Was it like they just brought the people back in, or did they have a large standing army?
A standing army? I don't know at this point. I would have to look into that.
What they would eat? What? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure if they were allowed a standing army at this point or not, or how big of one. I'm sure that Antigonus had one during this time. He knew that Herod was out there wanting to come back, wanting to take over, and would have been prepared for it. But whether, how official it was, whether on paper they were allowed to do that or not, I'm not sure. As king, Herod could have that sort of thing for sure. But it had been a while since anybody had officially been king of it. Not since the Roman takeover they had their own king. They called their high priest their king still, but he wasn't officially. And there was only one person after Herod the Great who had the title king, although a lot of people called themselves king and acted like kings, though they weren't, including Herod Antipas. Remember in the story of John the Baptist. Yeah, we'll get there later. But he very much behaves like a king and is called a king. And the disciples who came from Galilee refer to him as a king. That was the right thing to say about Herod. But according to the Romans, no, he would have been a tetrarch. But that's a Roman distinction, not so much a Jewish distinction there. All right, anything else? Yeah. Mark Antony. His downfall was the disagreements he had with Octavian. I mean, he fought for Octavian as Julius Caesar's heir, but personally, he didn't care for the guy at all. And yeah, we're going to see how that all happened next week as well. His relationship with Cleopatra had a lot to do with that falling out as well. But, all right, let's go ahead and close in prayer. Oh, yeah.
Why does that guy who's cutting that guy's head off look so much like a Jew?
Well, people look like people. I mean, it's hard to tell from behind. Yeah. But those are Romans all standing around there. Yeah. Yep. Antigonus is probably the only Jew in that picture. Yep. All right.
Okay.
Herod asked them to kill him. Yeah, because he was a problem. But let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you again for this morning, and thank you for preserving this history for us. Thank you for history, the way that it helps us understand who we are, help us to be aware of the things that we might accept as normal, the things that we might take for granted that are because of our personal heritage and not because they don't come directly from your word, from you. Help us to see the difference there. Help us to have your values and to put your glory first in our lives and to be a good example and provide a good foundation for those who come after us. In Jesus' name, amen.